I don't want to live in a world in which the greatest question that this country could envision, whether or not we send our brave men and women to fight on our behalf, is not a question that doesn't involve the collective conversation of this body and of the people of this nation. So I think it's an important resolution to debate here, and I hope my colleagues will support it. It doesn't really have to do with whether you think there is wisdom in this action or not, whether you think the president was right or wrong. This is an opportunity for us to stand up for our responsibility under the Constitution to be a co-equal branch in setting foreign policy. I have my thoughts on the wisdom of this action. I've stated that I think it's very dangerous when the President of the United States deliberately misleads the country about the efficacy of our military operations overseas or the threats presented to this country. It's unforgivable any time a president doesn't tell the truth, but it is especially unforgivable when the president doesn't tell the truth about national security intelligence.
Imagine waking up to find out the United States has launched a major military strike. No congressional debate, no public discussion, just one man's decision. Senator Chris Murphy argues that this is not only dangerous but unconstitutional. In today's debate, we unpack his speech, the wisdom of the Founding Fathers, and the urgent question of whether America is drifting toward executive-driven wars.
Mr. President, in a 1793 letter to William Cabell Reeves, James Madison said this. He said, "In no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislature and not to the executive department." A few years later, in another letter, this time to Thomas Jefferson as part of their famous correspondence, Madison expounded on that very simple superlative, naming the War Powers Clause in the Constitution as the most important. He said, "The Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It has accordingly, with studied care, vested the question of war in the legislature." Our Founding Fathers didn't get everything right. They didn't see ahead of time that this chamber would be divided in two, Republicans on one side, Democrats on the other side, but they knew, having watched the course of human history, that executives, in their day, mostly all monarchs and kings, had all sorts of reason to drag their nation into war. Power often came from war. The funding that could be raised for war, the loyalty commanded by war, the glory that occasionally came to the leader, the ruler, through war and through conquest. There was great risk in war, but there was also great reward in war. And there was far too much of it in the era in which our Constitution was being formed. The purpose of the founders was to give the American people a voice in government, a revolutionary idea at the time, but it was also to order our government in a way that war would become less likely, would become less frequent. They imagined a world, this new America, in which peace would be the rule, not war, as it was at the time for the citizens of Europe who lived under the rule of kings, prone to war, incentivized to war, as James Madison wrote to Thomas Jefferson. And so this part of the Constitution, with more wisdom in it than any other part of the Constitution, according to James Madison, is this section of our founding document that says it is not up to the ruler, it is not up to the executive branch, it is up to the branch of government most connected to the people to decide whether we go to war, to require that there be a debate, a conversation that involves everyone in this nation, that requires, that necessitates a collective decision as to whether to put the brave soldiers of this country and the collective security of the nation at risk. And so we are here today because we still find wisdom in that clause of the Constitution. We still see great risk in moving into a world, which we are quickly moving to, in which that clause that James Madison named as the supreme clause of the Constitution is dead letter. Is dead letter. And that is the risk. Because there are very few wars that are so planned, so far in advance, that there is time to come and have a month-long debate. Wars happen quickly, and they necessitate quick action according to the Constitution. Yes, we have always accepted that there has to be an exception, but a limited exception to that supreme clause in the Constitution. If there is an imminent attack against the United States, of course, the people of the United States want the ability of the President of the United States to respond to that imminent attack. But in the absence of an imminent attack, there is no exception. There is no ability to go around Congress. And in the case of the hostilities against Iran that the President began last weekend, there was no imminent threat against the United States. There was no army marching on this nation. There was no nuclear bomb that even existed that could be dropped on the United States or our soldiers in the region. And so it was required, it is required under the Constitution that the President come to Congress. If the President doesn't need to come to Congress to attack another nation preemptively, preventatively, absent an imminent threat, then that provision of the Constitution is dead letter, period, stop. And the most important piece of this document, according to our most revered founding father, is no longer operational. And if we lurch into a world in which any executive can send us to war without the participation of the American people, then we are in a world that our founding fathers could never have imagined. So I'm very glad to be on the floor today as a big fan of the wisdom of our founders to support Senator Kaine's resolution. And I appreciate his consistency in bringing this question before us. I don't want to live in a world in which the greatest question that this country could envision, whether or not we send our brave men and women to fight on our behalf, is not a question that doesn't involve the collective conversation of this body and of the people of this nation. So I think it's an important resolution to debate here, and I hope my colleagues will support it. It doesn't really have to do with whether you think there is wisdom in this action or not, whether you think the President was right or wrong. This is an opportunity for us to stand up for our responsibility under the Constitution to be a co-equal branch in setting foreign policy. I have my thoughts on the wisdom of this action. I've stated that I think it's very dangerous when the President of the United States deliberately misleads the country about the efficacy of our military operations overseas or the threats presented to this country. It's unforgivable any time a president doesn't tell the truth, but it is especially unforgivable when the president doesn't tell the truth about national security intelligence. I know my colleagues here come to different conclusions, but if the reporting is correct that Iran, even after these strikes, still has centrifuges and still has enriched uranium and still has scientists who know how to put those things together, then it just is not true that the program has been obliterated. That is a program that can be reconstituted in a relatively short amount of time because, of course, knowledge is not able to be destroyed by bombs. The only way that you are going to make this country and this world safe from Iran's nuclear weapons ambitions, and they have them, is diplomacy. I hope that diplomacy got easier because of these strikes, but I don't think they did. I don't think diplomacy got closer because of these strikes and whatever follow-on strikes may come, as President Trump is currently threatening. And so if diplomacy is the only path, if you can't bomb out of existence knowledge, then I don't think this was a very good week for American national security. But I come to a different conclusion than many of my Republican colleagues do, even some of my Democratic colleagues. But Senator Kaine's resolution is so important because that's the debate that we should be having. That's the argument that we should be having in public. That debate over the wisdom of dropping bombs in a far-off land that could put our troops at risk, that could drag us into a war, that's not a debate that the Founding Fathers thought that should take place behind closed doors at the Department of Defense, at the CIA, in the White House. That's actually the debate that they thought that this body should have, the United States Senate, that the House of Representatives should have. And that's the chance that we have today to bring that debate out of the shadows, out of the secret, to the place where the Founding Fathers thought it should exist. And that's why I urge my colleagues to support Senator Kaine's resolution. I yield the floor.
In the long and turbulent history of the United States, few questions have been as pressing, as consequential, and as constitutionally significant as the question of who has the power to take the nation to war. Senator Chris Murphy's recent remarks on the Senate floor serve as a powerful reminder of that founding tension between the executive and legislative branches, a tension that the framers of the Constitution understood all too well when they drafted the document that still governs American life today. At the heart of Murphy's speech is not just a critique of one president or one military action, but a broader warning. If America drifts into a world where presidents alone can drag the country into conflicts without congressional authorization, then one of the most essential protections against tyranny that the Founding Fathers built into the Constitution will have effectively collapsed. His words demand a deeper exploration, one that considers the historical wisdom of James Madison, the lessons of past wars, and the urgent need to restore the constitutional balance before it is too late. To begin with, it is worth recalling Madison's own words, which Murphy rightly invoked. Writing in 1793 to William Cabell and later to Thomas Jefferson, Madison articulated the reasoning that guided the framers when they vested the power to declare war in Congress rather than the executive. Madison recognized that throughout human history, kings, monarchs, and strongmen had repeatedly used war as a tool to expand their power, enrich their courts, and gain personal glory. The incentives were clear. War produced loyalty, patriotism, and sometimes fear, all of which could be harnessed by a ruler to consolidate authority. But for the people, war brought death, taxation, disruption of trade, and the curtailing of liberties. The founders knew that if America were to break from this destructive cycle, it had to create a system in which the decision to go to war would not rest in the hands of a single individual, but instead would require collective judgment by the representatives of the people. Congress, and only Congress, was entrusted with that grave responsibility. Murphy's speech presses the urgent point that this design is now in jeopardy. For decades, and especially in the modern era, presidents of both parties have increasingly asserted unilateral authority to use military force abroad. They have claimed expansive interpretations of their role as commander-in-chief, often citing the need for quick action or the existence of broad national security interests that supposedly justify strikes without congressional approval. From Korea to Vietnam, from Kosovo to Libya, from drone campaigns in Yemen and Pakistan to strikes in Syria and Iraq, the trend has been unmistakable. The executive branch has accumulated war powers that the framers never intended it to have. While Congress has occasionally pushed back, through the War Powers Resolution of 1973, for example, such efforts have often been weak, inconsistently applied, or simply ignored by presidents who insist that their constitutional authority overrides statutory restrictions. Murphy's warning is that this drift has reached a dangerous point. If a president can launch strikes on Iran without evidence of an imminent attack against the United States, then what limit truly remains? If the commander-in-chief may act preemptively, absent congressional debate and approval, then the essential principle that Madison identified as the Constitution's wisest safeguard becomes a dead letter. This is not a minor procedural matter. It is a fundamental shift in the architecture of American democracy. A decision that should involve the voices of 330 million citizens through their elected representatives is being replaced by the judgment of one man or woman in the Oval Office, often supported only by a narrow circle of advisors and intelligence briefings shielded from public scrutiny. Consider the implications. War is not just another policy choice. It is not equivalent to setting tax rates or determining regulatory standards. War puts the lives of American service members at risk, risks the security of civilians abroad, strains the economy, and reshapes the nation's foreign relations for years or decades. It is the most consequential decision any government can make. The founders placed it in Congress precisely because they wanted debate, deliberation, and dissent before such a path was taken. They wanted the public to be engaged, the costs to be considered, and the alternatives to be weighed. Murphy's argument is that by bypassing Congress, presidents are not only undermining the law, but also depriving the people of their rightful role in the most important debate a republic can have. The example of Iran highlights these dangers vividly. When President Trump ordered strikes without prior authorization from Congress, the justification given was the prevention of future attacks. Yet, as Murphy pointed out, there was no imminent threat, no army poised to march on American soil, no nuclear weapon ready to be dropped on U.S. troops or cities. By the standards the framers set, such action fell outside the legitimate powers of the executive. Moreover, the strategic wisdom of the strikes was questionable. Rather than weakening Iran's nuclear program permanently, they left knowledge and infrastructure largely intact, while increasing the likelihood of retaliation and escalation. Knowledge, as Murphy reminded, cannot be destroyed with bombs. Scientists still know how to enrich uranium, technology still exists, and centrifuges can be rebuilt. The only path to resolving such tension sustainably is diplomacy, not unilateral military action. Yet beyond the specifics of Iran, the broader principle remains paramount. If presidents may act in such ways without consequence, what stops future executives from doing the same against other nations? What prevents escalation into larger wars fought without congressional approval? History shows how quickly limited strikes can spiral into full-scale conflicts. Vietnam began with advisory roles and small deployments. It ended with 500,000 U.S. troops overseas and tens of thousands dead. The Iraq War, authorized but built on faulty intelligence, demonstrated how misinformation and executive overconfidence can lead to catastrophic outcomes. In both cases, the American people paid the price, in lives, in treasure, and in credibility, while the mechanisms of accountability lagged behind. Murphy also raised another essential point, the importance of truth in matters of war. When presidents mislead the public about the efficacy of military operations or the nature of threats, they undermine the very democratic foundation of national security decisions. If intelligence is exaggerated, manipulated, or cherry-picked to justify action, then neither Congress nor the people can make informed judgments. The Iraq War's infamous weapons of mass destruction debacle remains a painful example of what happens when truth is sacrificed in pursuit of war. For Murphy, such deception is not only dangerous but unforgivable. National security requires trust between leaders and citizens. Without it, democratic accountability collapses. Critics might argue that the modern world is too fast-moving for the framers' system to function. In an age of missiles that can strike within minutes, of cyber attacks that can cripple infrastructure instantly, presidents must be able to act decisively to protect the nation. Murphy acknowledges this point, as do most constitutional scholars. That is why the Constitution and subsequent interpretations have always recognized an exception for imminent threats. If an attack is about to occur, the president must have the authority to respond immediately. But the key word is imminent. Preventive wars, preemptive strikes, or broad campaigns of military action that are not in response to an immediate danger fall outside that category. They require congressional approval. To conflate long-term strategic challenges with imminent threats is to erase the very line that the Constitution drew to prevent executive abuse. The deeper issue, then, is not whether presidents may ever act unilaterally. They can, and they must in urgent cases. The issue is whether such actions remain the exception or have become the rule. Murphy's concern is that the exception is swallowing the rule, leaving Congress marginalized and the American people excluded from the most profound decisions of their government. If that trend continues, the United States risks transforming from a republic guided by debate into an empire driven by unilateral executive command. One must also reflect on the political culture that allows this shift. Congress itself has often been reluctant to assert its war powers. Many lawmakers prefer to avoid tough votes on war and peace, knowing that such votes can be politically costly. By allowing presidents to act alone, members of Congress can simultaneously criticize or support the action without bearing direct responsibility. This abdication of duty, however, is precisely what Madison and his peers feared, that representatives might avoid accountability, leaving power to accumulate in the executive. Murphy's support for Senator Tim Kaine's resolution is therefore not only about restraining one president, but about forcing Congress to reclaim its rightful role. It is a call for lawmakers to live up to their constitutional obligations, even when it is politically uncomfortable.
The stakes are immense. If Congress reasserts itself, the nation can restore balance, ensuring that wars are fought only after genuine debate and public consent. If not, the precedent will be further entrenched. Presidents will continue to act first and explain later, while the role of Congress fades into irrelevance. Over time, this would not only erode constitutional governance, but also weaken America's standing in the world. Allies and adversaries alike would see U.S. foreign policy as unpredictable, driven by the impulses of individuals rather than the considered judgment of a democratic system. The credibility of American diplomacy, already strained, would suffer further if war decisions appear arbitrary or unilateral. Diplomacy itself must remain central. Murphy insists that bombing knowledge out of existence is impossible, and history confirms this truth. The Cold War ended not because one side bombed the other into submission, but because of negotiations, arms control treaties, and gradual de-escalation. Even today, complex challenges like nuclear proliferation, terrorism, and climate-related security threats cannot be solved by military might alone. They require dialogue, patience, compromise, and the engagement of allies. To believe otherwise is to repeat the mistakes of the past, sacrificing long-term stability for short-term illusions of strength. What emerges from Murphy's speech, then, is not only a defense of constitutional principle, but also a vision of what democratic foreign policy should look like. It should be collective, transparent, and accountable. It should resist the temptations of unilateral power and instead embrace the messy but necessary process of debate. It should privilege diplomacy over war, truth over deception, and long-term security over short-term spectacle. Above all, it should honor the wisdom of the founders, who knew that the greatest safeguard against tyranny was to divide power, to check ambition with ambition, and to ensure that no single branch could decide questions of war and peace alone. The question now is whether Americans will heed this warning. The future of constitutional war powers does not depend solely on one speech or one resolution. It depends on whether Congress has the courage to reclaim its role, whether the public demands accountability, and whether presidents can be restrained from claiming powers that the framers never intended. It depends on whether the nation remembers that the Constitution was designed not for convenience but for liberty, not for efficiency but for accountability. Murphy's words echo across centuries, drawing from Madison's wisdom to challenge the present. If America drifts into a world where presidents decide wars unilaterally, it will have abandoned one of the most important lessons of history: that unchecked power leads to conflict, that war without debate leads to ruin, and that the health of a republic depends on the willingness of its people and representatives to shoulder the burdens of decision-making. The choice is stark. Either Congress reasserts its authority and restores the balance, or the nation slides into a future where the most consequential decision any government can make rests in the hands of one individual. That is not the America the founders imagined, and it is not the America Murphy envisions. Whether it becomes the America of the future depends on what happens next. The question before us is not just about one strike or one president. It is about whether the Constitution's most sacred guardrail against war still stands. If we allow the executive branch to dominate this decision unchecked, we drift closer to the very monarchs our founders rebelled against. Senator Murphy's warning is clear. America must choose peace through debate, not war through unilateral power. The founders left us wisdom. The question is, will we follow it?